Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sunday Reads with Renee. My name is Renee here at Simply Renee. Thank you so much for watching, liking, sharing, commenting, and clicking the notification bell to my videos. I truly appreciate it as it helps me to grow, and thank you for subscribing to my channel as well. For today's video, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about Anne Bronte. She is a 19th century English writer who was part of the literary Bronte sisters, her more famous ones being Charlotte and Emily Bronte. And I wanted to discuss her a little bit because I consider Anne Bronte to be an overshadowed and underrated literary sister, especially in 19th century literature. Before I begin, I just want to let everyone know I will be using alternative words and phrases due to YouTube rules and regulations, and I will also be revealing plot details to the Bronte sister novels, especially endings, therefore spoilers are ahead. Today's video is all about Anne Bronte, a 19th century writer who is often overshadowed and overlooked by her more famous sisters, Charlotte and Emily Bronte. If you're familiar with Charlotte and Emily Bronte, their most famous novels have stood the test of time, and we're still talking about them in 2026. Those novels are Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. And they are great books. They're actually in my top 10 of all time because they're such wonderful books and I enjoy their plot lines. I understand Wuthering Heights is a more controversial one. It's pretty much the most beloved and divisive one in classic literature, at least in my opinion, but I do surprisingly like it because I get what Emily Bronte was trying to say. Nonetheless, despite these great works and the talent that Charlotte and Emily have, Anne Bronte is often overlooked, and I don't think she gets enough of her due credit, and I think she should be talked about a little bit more because I think she also had talent and a lot to say in her stories as well. Anne's most famous novel is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, published in 1848. And while a great novel, it's often overshadowed by Charlotte and Emily's more famous works, Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. Whereas Charlotte and Emily were more Gothic Romance in terms of these novels, Anne was the exact opposite of it. For Anne, a lot of her work focused primarily on social issues of the day and time in the 1840s, lack of women's rights, DV, addiction, as well as growing feminist social issues of her contemporary time in the 1840s. This is not to say you can't find these themes in Wuthering Heights or Charlotte's works. Jane Eyre is considered feminist literature and does focus on poor school conditions, DV, and more. Wuthering Heights is not considered feminist literature, but does focus on DV, jealousy, revenge, and its effects, and how generational trauma can affect a household. Yet Anne's works get overshadowed despite the wonderfully written prose on these themes. According to some experts, Anne's legacy was likely destroyed due to Charlotte Bronte. When Anne passed in 1849, she was the last of Charlotte's remaining siblings, and there was a love there. Charlotte was with Anne when she passed away, and Anne's famous last words were, "Take courage, Charlotte." Charlotte also wrote a poem about her grief over the loss of Anne. That's why some, including myself, do believe that Charlotte was trying to be more protective older sister. When The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was published in 1848, it had shocked Victorian society for many different reasons. Now, it did receive praise and criticism, but there was significant backlash that Charlotte and Emily had experienced with their respective novels, too. In The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, it did receive a lot of significant backlash because it had genuinely shocked Victorian society with its depictions of DV, addiction, and a woman leaving her violent situation in order to not just find self-sufficiency, but to ensure that her young son does not really have that influence from his toxic father who had all these problems and issues and was a violent person himself. According to accounts, Charlotte Bronte was very disturbed and unsettled by this book entirely. She believed her sister had very good intentions in writing it, but felt it was too much for readers at that time, which is peculiar in a way because here is Charlotte Bronte writing Jane Eyre, where one of the characters is a mad woman in an attic, which did unsettle people at that time. And there's also depictions of harsh school environments, which also shock society too. And Wuthering Heights had its own shocking elements as well. Yet Charlotte didn't do too much heavy criticism on Emily's work compared to what she did with Anne's in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. It's why some people think there was jealousy on Charlotte's part, that Anne was the better writer, and why she refused the republication of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall in 1850, writing, "Wildfell Hall, it hardly appears to me desirable to preserve. The choice of subject in that work is a mistake. It was too little consonant with the character, tastes, and ideas of the gentle, retiring, inexperienced writer. She wrote it under a strange, conscientious, half-ascetic,
notion of accomplishing a painful penance and a severe duty. She had, in the course of her life, been called on to contemplate, near at hand and for a long time, the terrible effects of talents misused and faculties abused. Hers was naturally a sensitive, reserved, and dejected nature. What she saw sank very deeply into her mind. It did her harm. She brooded over it till she believed it to be a duty to reproduce every detail as a warning to others.
Not a great thing to do to your sister's legacy, but nonetheless, this was stated and written in 1850 and has had an impact on Anne's legacy in so many different ways, as well as her reputation. Nonetheless, in my own general opinion, I do believe that Charlotte was being more of a protective older sister. She had seen the backlash that had come with Jane Eyre, but also on her sister's other novels because they were writing about Victorian society and exposing the more darker elements to the public, challenging it completely in a time when you didn't really see women do that. And I think because they were women, that they ended up really getting a lot of prejudice as a result, because there are arguments that, oh, there's no way that women can come up with these kinds of stories. Only men can come up with it. So there is a little bit of a prejudice because they were women writing these stories a lot. But I also think there was a possibility too of the fact that they're shocking Victorian society because they're exposing, again, those darker elements to the public that they just weren't really ready for.
Anne's novel, Agnes Grey, was published in 1847 and based on her experience as a governess, detailing how this position, one of the few for unmarried women to make money, can be an oppressive and cruel environment, where governesses are not respected and treated poorly. There are also depictions of animal cruelty and how it relates to Agnes's treatment as a governess. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is the more superior work. Before the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, a married woman had no legal rights. She could not suit for divorce, have custody of her children, own property, or have any rights outside of her marriage. Helen takes the initiative to go against English law and society rules by leaving her husband and taking her son with her, earning income as an artist and trying to protect not just herself, but also her son from his toxic father's influence. While this shocked society, Helen still believed in her husband's chance at redemption towards the end when he was on his deathbed, bringing a theme of universal salvation in which redemption can still be found, and something that Anne Bronte was known to have believed herself. Furthermore, Anne wrote her novels from a sense of realism, openly defending her work by stating, "When we have to do with the vice and vicious characters, I maintain it is better to depict them as they really are than as they would wish to appear. To represent a bad thing in its least offensive light is doubtless the most agreeable course for a writer of fiction to pursue. But is it the most honest or the safest? Is it better to reveal the sneers and pitfalls of life to the young and thoughtless traveler, or to cover them with branches and flowers?"
And that's very telling about Anne and who she was as a writer, as well as her thought process. She's grounded in realism. She cares about telling the truth and showing things for what they really are because she does have a interest in it. She also has that as mattering to her because she experienced this in terms of being a governess. Agnes Grey is very much based on Anne's own experience as a governess and what she went through. And she also has seen how addiction destroys a family. Branwell Bronte, her only brother, did have addiction issues that really affected and destroyed him, but also did affect the family in so many different ways. So she, like her sisters, had those experiences. They are telling the stories of things that they have witnessed and experienced themselves. Anne is actually not unlike Charlotte and Emily in showing the darker sides to Victorian society and really putting that out to the public. At the same time, the realism that Anne Bronte portrayed did nonetheless shake Charlotte and society itself. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Anne was not writing Gothic romance. She wasn't glossing over everything. She was actually showing it for what it really is and wasn't under the disguise of Gothic romance.
In Catherine Taylor's 2020 article, Anne Bronte, the Radical Sister Overlooked by History, she states, "Unlike her sisters, Anne refused to romanticize anything."
Which is true. Even though I have a soft spot for Rochester, I do believe he needed to pay for the sins he committed in that book by losing his home, becoming disfigured, and beginning the path towards redemption now that he's lost everything and has a second chance with Jane. And while I surprisingly like Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff has been interpreted as a Byronic hero, even though that's not very fitting towards him. He is someone who is a brute who's hell bent on revenge, especially the woman he loved because she betrayed him. But as a result, it ends up becoming a very toxic, all consuming love that affects everyone, even into the next generation, who now have to break that cycle of DV and trauma.
Anne doesn't do that in her books. While Agnes Grey does find happiness and love with a good man at the end, her role as a governess is not romanticized in any way, shape, or form. Agnes Grey is a book that depicts the harsh realities, and they're seen for what they are, especially when it comes to how employers treat Agnes, how the children that she's in charge of teaching treat her as well. This is similar to the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, in which the harsh realities of a toxic marriage are displayed: addiction, infidelity, DV, and a married woman's decision in the 19th century to forge her own path by leaving a toxic marriage were not romanticized. Even when Helen returns to her husband, now ill, to be at his deathbed, she hopes for his redemption, only to be met with his lack of accountability, and yet still believes in universal salvation, hoping her husband will find it. And while Helen does find happiness with a good man in the aftermath, Wildfell Hall nonetheless depicts a sense of realism Victorian society was not ready for.
This is why I do see Anne Bronte as an underrated author of the 19th century. She's someone that is writing a lot of things about realism and commentaries related to the darker sides of Victorian society. She's highlighting how there's a lack of women's rights, the damage of addiction to a family as well as a marriage, and how the trauma of DV is a very real thing and can affect everybody. And she's not romanticizing that in any way, shape, or form. And there's also the fact that Anne does believe in universal salvation and depicting life as it is for some and how it affects women and children and how that society really doesn't always help them out in the best way, even if there is good intentions behind it.
Anne is not writing romance or even Gothic romance. She's not writing to sugarcoat harsh, grim reality. She's telling stories that speak to people about toxic relationships and the cruel realities of women's lack of rights in the 1840s, which still remain rather relevant today, despite how far we have come in creating better laws to try and protect people in these violent environments.
In her living life, Anne Bronte was already being overshadowed by Charlotte and Emily because all of them had published their books at the same time. Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights just got greater attention, even with criticism, praise, and significant backlash. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall also received that, but for whatever reason, Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights got greater attention at that time in the late 1840s. Nonetheless, Charlotte Bronte did have a hand in ruining the reputation and legacy of Anne Bronte, even if it was within the good intentions of protecting her sister. Charlotte had prevented the republication of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall with that statement I mentioned earlier in this video, which did put a negative side to this book and did end up causing a lot of people to not pay attention to Anne until the mid 20th century when people started to really reinvest in her works and find, hey, Wildfell Hall was ahead of its time and it is considered a feminist novel and a piece of feminist literature. And it really shows that Anne was ahead of her time as she's focusing on a toxic marriage and a woman trying to find self-sufficiency and independence from that. Agnes Grey did receive republication in the 1850s, but it wasn't as seen as controversial as Wildfell Hall, so that's why Agnes Grey is a little bit more well known. But it is a shame that because of Charlotte preventing the republication of Wildfell Hall, that Anne's legacy and reputation were not really seen until more than 100 years later. It's why many like myself recommend reading and reevaluating Anne Bronte and her works, as well as her place in 19th century literature, because she truly is an underrated and talented writer, along with her sisters Emily and Charlotte. She definitely does have her place in history before being ahead of her time and writing a lot about feminist issues and also the darker sides of Victorian society that are not romanticized or laced with romance in them, even though Agnes Grey and Wildfell Hall do have a little bit of romance in it towards the end. What Anne is trying to focus on is more social issues of that time in the 1840s and bringing it to light into the public, which I think were very important then and actually still remain very relevant today, especially Wildfell Hall, her most famous work. How many of us still see situations where this happens even in real life in 2026? So it is still very relevant even today. This concludes my video on Anne Bronte, the overshadowed and underrated sister of the Bronte family. Now tell me what you think. Do you agree with me or not agree with me? Have you read Anne Bronte's works? Did you like one of her books or both? Do you think she is an underrated and overshadowed sister? Do you think she deserves to be seen as just as talented as her sisters, Charlotte and Emily? Do you think more attention should be on her or not? Let me know in the comments down below. I welcome all discussions as always. I thank you so much for tuning in. I've listed in the description box the sources that I used along with some additional information as well, so you can look up that yourself. I recommend AnneBronte.org, which is managed by Nick Holland, who wrote a book called In Search of Anne Bronte. I haven't read that book yet, but it is recommended because it is an excellent biography that does give more detail into the life of Anne Bronte, who she was, her thought processes, and how she has this place in 19th century literature and should still remain relevant even today in 2026. And it also focuses on the other Bronte sisters and the family too. I thank you again so much for tuning in. I'll be back next Sunday with a Sunday Reads video, which focuses more on my entire overview, thought process sort of reviews of the summer 2026 reads I did, along with what I'm having for summer 2026 and those plans. I'm almost done with all those books for summer 2026, so I'm very excited. And also, I'll be back on Wednesday with a regular video, Friday with a food video, and showing more shorts this week. I'm glad I picked it up a little bit more last week and putting some more on, so I'm looking forward to continuing that this week. I thank you again so much for tuning in. Please be sure to like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell. I'll see you next time. Bye.